The photograph arrives at Vito Genovese's office on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a messenger nobody recognizes who vanishes before anyone thinks to follow him. Genovese is in his downtown Manhattan office, surrounded by men who've worked for him for decades. And when he opens the envelope and sees what's inside, his expression doesn't change. But the men who know him well notice how his fingers tighten around the paper. It's an image of 125th Street, taken from a high window, showing a line of people waiting outside a small cigar shop. There's nothing threatening about the photo. No blood, no violence. Just ordinary people queuing for something the Italians believed belonged to them. On the back of the photograph, written in clear, firm handwriting, is a single sentence that reads, "The money stays home now." Genovese knows immediately who sent this. Bumpy Johnson just got out of Alcatraz after 11 years, and in less than a month, he's done something no black man in New York has dared to do before. He's directly challenged Italian control over Harlem without asking permission or offering apologies. Bumpy had returned to a Harlem he barely recognized. The streets were still full of music and life, but there was a new darkness in the alleys, in the eyes of young men selling heroin on corners like they were selling newspapers. During the decade Bumpy spent locked away, the Italian families had turned Harlem into an extraction mine. They controlled the numbers, the drugs, the gambling, the loans. Every dollar spent in Harlem's underworld ended up in the hands of men who lived in big houses on Long Island and who'd never walked down Lenox Avenue except to collect money. What bothered Bumpy most wasn't just the extraction of wealth. It was the complete absence of respect. The Italians treated Harlem like conquered territory, a place where they could do whatever they wanted without consequences, because they assumed black people didn't have the power or organization to resist. The first days after his release, Bumpy did nothing visible. He visited his wife Mamie at their apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. He sat in St. Nicholas Park watching children play. He went to church on Sunday and listened to the Reverend talk about redemption and second chances. People who saw him thought maybe prison had changed him, that maybe he'd come out an old, tired man ready to retire. But the people who knew him better, who'd worked with him before he was arrested, noticed something different. They noticed that Bumpy was listening. He was in barbershops and bars, in nightclubs and restaurants, absorbing information about how Harlem worked now, who had power, who was unhappy, where the cracks were in the system the Italians had built. The numbers operation was the heart of the Italian empire in Harlem. Every day, thousands of residents bet small amounts on three-digit combinations, hoping their number would come up and change their lives. The game had been invented by black entrepreneurs in the 20s, a form of lottery for people who couldn't afford the big bets at downtown casinos. But the Italians had taken it by force in the 40s, buying out or intimidating the original operators until the entire system was under their control. They used local runners to collect the bets, but the money flowed to banks controlled by the families, and payouts were decided in offices where no Harlem resident would ever set foot. Bumpy Johnson understood something fundamental about power that the Italians never grasped. In Harlem, legitimacy mattered more than force. You could control the streets with guns and threats for a while, but eventually people would find ways to resist if they felt you weren't one of them. The Italians were outsiders, and everyone in Harlem knew it. Bumpy was different. He'd been born in South Carolina but raised on these streets. He knew the grandmothers who sat on stoops, the shopkeepers struggling to survive, the musicians playing in the nightclubs. When Bumpy talked about giving Harlem back to its people, it wasn't empty rhetoric. It was a man talking about his home. He started his counterattack in a way the Italians didn't expect. He didn't strike at their operations directly. He didn't try to intimidate their collectors or burn down their establishments. Instead, he did something simpler and more devastating. He opened his own numbers bank and made it better than theirs. He paid higher percentages on winnings. He settled bets faster. He hired runners from the neighborhood, people everyone trusted, instead of strangers who treated every transaction as an opportunity to intimidate. And most importantly, he promised that every penny Benton won stayed in Harlem, reinvested in local businesses, in jobs for local residents, in an economy that benefited the people who actually lived there. The response was immediate. In the first week, dozens of regular players switched from the Italian bank to Bumpy's. In the second week, some of the Italian runners themselves were secretly placing bets with Bumpy's operation. By the third week, the Italians had lost nearly a third of their numbers business in Harlem, and the men reporting to Genovese were starting to panic. They'd built their entire system assuming there would be no competition, that nobody would dare challenge them. Bumpy Johnson had just proven that assumption wrong. Tony Salerno, who oversaw Harlem operations for the Genovese family, decided they needed to send a message. They couldn't allow a competitor to just spring up and steal business without consequences. That would make them look weak, and in the world of organized crime, the perception of weakness was more dangerous than actual weakness. Salerno chose his target carefully. There was a small diner on 116th Street called Minnie's Place, owned by a woman named Wilhelmina Grant, who'd been taking bets for Bumpy. The place was popular, known in the neighborhood, exactly the kind of target that would send the right message. One night at 3 a.m, two men smashed the windows of Minnie's Place and threw Molotov cocktails inside. The fire spread fast, destroying the interior before the fire department arrived. Wilhelmina Grant wasn't in the building when it happened, but she lost everything. 20 years of work, all her savings invested in that business, gone in a single night. The police took a report and did nothing. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who was responsible, but nobody was going to testify against the Italian mob. Except something shifted in the days after the fire. The anger in Harlem didn't direct itself at Bumpy Johnson for starting a war. It directed itself at the Italians for proving they'd burn down the neighborhood before they'd let black people control their own destiny. Bumpy visited Wilhelmina at her sister's apartment where she was staying. They talked for 2 hours. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but witnesses who saw Bumpy leaving reported that he had the look of a man who just made a promise he intended to keep. That same night, 4 Italian-owned businesses in Harlem were hit. Not mob operations, just ordinary storefronts that happened to have Italian names on the signs. Windows smashed, merchandise damaged, nothing burned because Bumpy wasn't trying to hurt civilians. But the message was unmistakable. If the Italians wanted to play with fire, Bumpy could make it so expensive for them to operate in Harlem that they'd beg to leave. Vito Genovese understood immediately that this was different from the usual territorial disputes. This wasn't some hothead trying to make a name for himself by challenging the mob. Bumpy Johnson was executing a strategy that threatened the entire structure of Italian control in New York. If they let a black gangster push them out of Harlem, it would encourage challenges everywhere. Other neighborhoods, other ethnic groups, would start thinking that maybe the Italians weren't as untouchable as everyone believed. Genovese needed to respond in a way that reasserted dominance without turning Harlem into a war zone that would bring federal heat nobody wanted. He arranged a meeting, not with Bumpy directly, that would have implied they were equals, but with intermediaries who could speak for both sides. The meeting took place in a social club in the Bronx Neutral Ground. Genovese sent Tony Salerno and 2 capos who handled muscle work. Bumpy sent a lawyer named Herbert Young and a man everyone called Junie Bird who'd been Bumpy's right hand since the 40s. The meeting lasted 7 hours. The Italians laid out their position. The numbers operation in Harlem was their property, taken legitimately when the previous operators couldn't defend their territory. Bumpy Johnson was welcome to work in Harlem, but he needed to work under them, pay tribute, and accept their authority. In exchange, they'd give him a percentage and let him operate with some independence. Junie Bird listened to all of this without interrupting. When the Italians finished, he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the Bronx streets for a long moment. Then he turned back and said something that everyone in that room would remember for years. He said, "You boys got it backwards. You think Harlem is something you own because you took it from somebody weak. But Harlem ain't property, it's people. And those people are tired of watching their money leave every night in bags you carry downtown. So here's what's happening. You're closing your numbers operation in Harlem. You're pulling out your heroin dealers. You're doing it before the month ends. Because if you don't, Bumpy's going to make it so hot for you up there that you'll spend more defending it than you'll ever make from it." Salerno actually smiled. He looked at Junie like he was a child who didn't understand reality. He said, "You think we're scared of Bumpy Johnson? We got 600 made men in this city. We got judges, cops, politicians in our pocket. What's Bumpy got? Some old thieves in a neighborhood that'll forget about him the second things get hard?" Junie didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like Salerno had confirmed something he already knew. Then he and the lawyer walked out, and the meeting was over. 3 days later, a sergeant named Michael Capelli got a phone call at his home in Brooklyn. Capelli was on the Genovese payroll, one of about 20 cops who made sure the Italian families got advance warning about raids and investigations. The voice on the phone didn't give a name, but it gave Capelli very specific information. Locations of 3 heroin-cutting houses in the Bronx. Names of the men running them and the times they'd be there. Details about a shipment coming in from Montreal. The voice said if Capelli made these arrests, the evidence would be so clean he could probably make lieutenant. Then it hung up. Capelli spent hours trying to decide if it was a trap, but the information was too detailed to ignore. He made the bus. The newspapers called him a hero. The department gave him a medal, and Vito Genovese realized that Bumpy Johnson had sources inside places that were supposed to be completely secure. The heroin trade was more delicate than numbers. It generated huge money, but also brought serious heat. The Italian families had been careful to maintain separation between their heroin operations and their other businesses, using buffers and cutouts to protect themselves. Bumpy's message was devastating. If the Italians kept coming at him, he'd expose their operations to law enforcement in ways that couldn't be fixed with bribes or violence. He'd feed information to newspapers. He'd turn their strength, their size, and visibility into a liability. Genovese started getting reports from his men that didn't make immediate sense. Italian collectors were being followed, not by cops, but by civilians, with cameras who document their movements and then vanish. Dealers were getting robbed, but the thieves only took product, not cash, and the heroin would turn up at police stations with anonymous tips about who it belonged to. Witnesses who normally wouldn't talk to police were suddenly coming forward in cases involving Italian defendants. It wasn't a conventional war. It was something more sophisticated. Bumpy was weaponizing the system against them, using their own corruption and visibility as tools to dismantle their operations. The breaking point came in April. A heroin shipment worth $300,000 disappeared from a warehouse in Newark. The warehouse was owned by a company that laundered money for the Genovese family. The guards were found tied up but unharmed, and the product was just gone. For 4 days, Genovese's people tore apart Newark looking for it, leaning on every informant they had, questioning every dealer, trying to figure out who was crazy enough to steal from them. Then the heroin showed up in the evidence room of the Newark Police Department, along with detailed records showing where it came from, who owned the warehouse, and where the shipment was headed. The investigation that followed reached deep into Genovese operations in New Jersey and took years to contain. Genovese couldn't prove Bumpy was behind it, but he knew. The question was what to do. He could start an all-out war, flood Harlem with soldiers, try to kill Bumpy and everyone who stood with him. But that would destroy the neighborhood and bring federal attention that would cripple operations citywide. Or he could accept that Harlem was lost and consolidate power elsewhere, in areas where they weren't facing this kind of organized resistance. Neither option was acceptable. Both meant admitting that a black gangster had outmaneuvered the Italian mob on their own territory. The withdrawal happened slowly, without any dramatic announcement. Italian numbers banks in Harlem started closing. The collectors stopped making their rounds. The heroin operations moved to other neighborhoods. It took 6 months, quiet enough that most outsiders didn't notice the transition. But by the fall of 1963, Bumpy Johnson controlled organized crime in Harlem more completely than anyone had in 20 years. He'd done it without a major shootout, without assassinations, without giving law enforcement a clear reason to come after him. The mainstream newspapers never covered it. There were no headlines about a power shift in Harlem's underworld. The journalists who wrote about organized crime focused on the Italian families, on the mafia as they understood it, and they didn't see what happened in black neighborhoods as part of that story. But everyone in Harlem knew. They saw the Italian collectors disappear. They saw the numbers operations come back under local control. They saw that heroin, while it didn't vanish completely, became less visible, less aggressive, handled by people who at least lived in the community they were poisoning. And they saw Bumpy Johnson walking the streets like a man who'd reclaimed something that belonged to him, because in every way that mattered, he had. Wilhelmina Grant reopened her diner 6 months later in a new location on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy paid for the renovations personally, though he never took public credit. The place became a gathering spot where people came to hear real information about what was happening in the neighborhood, and Wilhelmina became one of Bumpy's most reliable sources of intelligence. Not because she was paid, but because he'd stood up for her when he could have ignored her, and because the new order in Harlem, whatever its flaws, felt like it belonged to the people who actually lived there. Vito Genovese never spoke publicly about what happened in Harlem. Internally, he told his capos that the neighborhood wasn't worth the trouble, that the money they'd been making there was small compared to their operations elsewhere, and that holding it would have cost more than it generated. Some of his men believed him. Others understood they'd been outplayed by someone who understood power better than they did, who knew that violence was the weakest form of control because it created resistance faster than it eliminated opposition. Bumpy Johnson lived another 5 years after he took back Harlem. He died of a heart attack in 1968 at Wells Restaurant, sitting at a table with friends. By then, he'd become something rare in the criminal world, a figure who commanded both fear and genuine respect. Someone who proved that power didn't have to flow exclusively from brutality. The neighborhood he fought for would face new challenges after his death, new threats and new predators. But for several years in the mid-60s, Harlem belonged to itself in a way it hadn't before, and wouldn't again for a long time. Everyone who was there, everyone who witnessed what Bumpy did and understood how he did it, knew they'd seen something that fundamentally changed the rules about who could hold power in New York and how they could take it.